Story 1. Midnight Call. Maggie had just finished a long day at work and collapsed onto the sofa in her small apartment. She didn't usually believe in the supernatural or the paranormal. To her, the world always operated according to scientific laws, and things that people couldn't explain were simply a lack of information, not supernatural. But that night, she received a call that changed everything. Around midnight, as Maggie was drifting off to sleep, the phone on her bedside table suddenly vibrated, the screen's light illuminating the room. She frowned, looking at the screen. The number displayed was not an unknown number. It was Lisa, her best friend, who had died in a car accident exactly a year ago. Maggie's heart was pounding. Her hands were shaking as she picked up the phone. "No way," she muttered. Still, she pressed the answer button. "Hello," her voice caught in her throat. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, but not absolute silence. There was a faint crackle, as if the signal was getting stuck. And then a voice, small, faint, but clear. "Maggie." "It's me, Lisa." Maggie froze. She was sure it was Lisa's voice, a familiar, slightly hoarse voice, but now it sounded as if it were coming from far away. "Lisa, what kind of joke is this?" she asked loudly, trying to contain her fear. "I need your help," the voice continued, broken as if it were strangled. "I'm trapped. I can't leave." "Leave where?" "Lisa, where are you?" Maggie shouted, but the call abruptly disconnected. The phone screen said "call ended," and the number disappeared from the recent calls list. Maggie couldn't sleep after the call. Memories of Lisa flooded back, from happy conversations to the day she received the news of her death. Lisa had been killed in a car accident on a rainy night. Her car had crashed into a canal near town, and although the police found her body, they never found Lisa's phone. The next day, Maggie told Lisa's mother the story. But instead of thinking it was a cruel prank, Lisa's mother just sighed. "You're not the first person to get a call from Lisa," she said, her eyes sad. "A few other people have said they've gotten texts or calls from her. But we don't know what to do with it." She pointed to a small box on a shelf, filled with old photos of Lisa and her favorite things. Maggie noticed one photo in particular. It was of Lisa standing next to an old bridge, where she had said she felt strange every time she crossed it. Maggie remembered that it was the bridge over the canal, near where Lisa had had her accident. That evening, Maggie decided to drive to the bridge. Part of her wanted to see if there was anything special there, but mostly she wanted to feel like she was doing something, even if only to dispel the haunting memory of the phone call. By the time she got there, night had fallen, and the bridge was shrouded in thick fog. She stood in the middle of the bridge, her flashlight dimly illuminating her path, and called out Lisa's name. "Lisa, if you're here, let me know." There was nothing but the wind and the quiet water below. Maggie sighed, feeling silly. But just as she turned to leave, the phone in her pocket vibrated again. This time, the number didn't appear on the screen. There was just a simple line, "Incoming call." Maggie pressed the answer button, and immediately, Lisa's voice rang out. "You shouldn't have come here, Maggie." Maggie stood still. "Why?" "Lisa, where are you?" she shouted, but Lisa's voice was only a whisper. "They're coming." "Who?" "Lisa, what are you talking about?" Maggie panicked. But before she could hear more, a shrill scream came from the other end of the line, and the phone fell from her hand, the screen going black. At that moment, Maggie felt a cold chill wash over her. She turned around and saw a blurry figure standing in the middle of the bridge, right where she had been standing. It was Lisa, her face pale, her eyes filled with fear, but not fear of her. Lisa was staring behind Maggie. Maggie slowly turned her head, and in the mist, she saw other shadows. They were shapeless, but their red eyes flashed in the darkness. A distorted laugh rang out, and Maggie felt as if she couldn't move. "Run, Maggie!" Lisa's voice screamed, but Maggie's body was stiff, her legs unable to move. The next morning, a local found Maggie lying unconscious on the bridge. When she woke up, she didn't remember how she got out, but the only thing she could say was, "Lisa, she's still there." From that day on, Maggie never went to the bridge again. But every night, when she turned off the lights, her phone vibrated. Even though there was no number on the screen, she knew that Lisa was still trying to contact her, but she didn't have the courage to answer. And in her dreams, she always saw herself standing on the bridge with Lisa. But this time, the shadows were there too, getting closer and closer. Story 2. The Elevator Game. The story of the elevator game originated in an online forum where it was said that if you followed a series of strict rules, you could enter another world. The game required you to use a building at least 10 stories high with a functioning elevator. Curious but daring people warned that if you did it wrong, you might never return to the real world. Claire and her group of friends, Mark, Lily, and Ethan, decided to take on the elevator game on a moonless night. They chose an old abandoned office building where the elevator was still working. Despite the feeling of dread lurking in their hearts, they all laughed to relieve the tension. "It's just a joke," Mark said, patting Claire on the back. "There's nothing to be afraid of." As instructed, they entered the elevator and pressed the buttons in a specific order. Floor 4, Floor 2, Floor 6, Floor 2, Floor 10, Floor 5. When they reached the 5th floor, according to legend, a woman would enter the elevator. You were not to talk to her or look at her, no matter what. The group held their breath as the elevator stopped at the 5th floor. The doors opened. Outside the hallway was pitch black, nothing but absolute silence. But as the doors were about to close, Lily suddenly shouted, "Wait!" Someone was just standing around that corner. No one else saw anything, but Claire felt a chill run down her spine. Ethan forced a smile, trying to appear calm. "It's just darkness, don't panic." The elevator doors closed, and they continued their journey, but the air in the cabin was now heavier. When the elevator reached the 10th floor, the doors opened and a strange sight appeared before her eyes. Outside was not a normal corridor, but a land that stretched out with a red light like an eternal sunset. The ground was covered with black sand, and the dilapidated buildings rose in the distance, like ghosts of an abandoned city. "Is this real?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling. Mark stepped out of the elevator, unable to resist his curiosity. "This is the other world they talk about," he said, his eyes never leaving the surreal scene before him. Claire shouted, "Mark, don't go too far. We have to go back." But before she could stop him, Mark had already stepped away from the elevator, his figure fading into the red light. "We shouldn't be here," Ethan said, his voice tense. "We have to press the button to go back now." Claire nodded, pressing the one button to bring the elevator back to the 1st floor. But nothing happened. The buttons didn't work, and the door was still open, as if inviting them to step out. Suddenly, Lily gasped. "Did you hear that?" The group fell silent, listening, and at that moment, a creepy sound rang out. Footsteps, heavy and steady, coming from somewhere far away in the red light. "What was that?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with fear. But before anyone could answer, a figure appeared in the distance. It was a woman, dressed in an old white dress, her hair covering her face. She didn't walk, but rather glided over the ground, coming straight toward them. "Don't look. Don't say anything," Claire shouted, remembering the rule. But Lily couldn't bear it. She looked straight at the woman and shouted, "Who are you?" The woman stopped, her head tilted to one side, as if observing Lily. Then, without warning, she rushed toward the elevator at a terrifying speed. Claire quickly pressed the close button, but the elevator doors were too slow to close. Ethan and Claire pulled Lily inside, and the doors closed just as the woman reached them. A loud knock sounded from outside, each knock shaking the cabin. The elevator suddenly started moving, but instead of going down, it started going up, faster than any elevator Claire had ever been on. "Floor 10. Where are we going?" Ethan shouted. No one answered because no one knew. The elevator stopped again, and the doors opened. Before them was the same hallway of the 10th floor of the abandoned building, but something was wrong. Everything was the same as before, but it felt distorted. The walls were more cracked, the neon lights flickered, and the space smelled of burning. "Are we back?" Claire asked, but her voice was full of doubt. As they stepped out of the elevator, the group realized there was no way out. The path leading to the emergency stairs disappeared, leaving only endless corridors. Every time they turned around, they saw the elevator door standing right behind them, even though they had walked far away. The footsteps echoed again, this time coming from all directions. The woman's voice rang out, but it was not a whisper but a shrill, hateful scream. "You are not allowed to leave." The elevator doors opened again, and inside there was no cabin, but a bottomless pit of darkness. The next morning, the abandoned office building was as empty as ever. There was no trace of Claire, Mark, Lily, or Ethan. Locals sometimes said that on moonless nights, they could hear the elevator moving even though the building had no electricity. And if you walked in, you might find an elevator open, waiting for someone to dare to play its game. Story 4. The Creeping Fog. The town of Hollow Creek is surrounded by hills and dense forests, where fog often appears every morning. But the fog here is unlike any other. It is thick, heavy, and sometimes seems to move in ways that no one can explain. The locals call it the crawling fog, a fog that is said to carry forgotten souls, always looking for someone to drag into the afterlife. On a cold evening in early winter, James, a young photographer, comes to Hollow Creek to do a project on the wilderness landscape. He heard that the fog here is especially beautiful at night, creating surreal images. Not believing the local stories, James decides to go out in the middle of the night to take pictures. He drives to the area near Black Hollow Lake, which is said to be the center of the legends about the fog. When they arrived, the fog had already begun to spread, crawling across the ground like a living thing. James stopped the car, took out his camera, and stepped out, breathing in the cold air. The light from the headlights shone through the fog, creating a mysterious scene. James smiled, certain that he would get some great photos. He raised his camera and clicked, not realizing that the fog was gradually getting closer, enveloping him bit by bit. At first, everything was normal, but as James took a few photos, he began to notice something strange. In the camera screen, among the wisps of fog, he saw the silhouette of a woman. She stood in the distance, wearing a white dress, her long hair hanging loosely over her face. James lowered the camera and looked straight ahead, but saw nothing. He lifted the camera again. The silhouette was still there, and this time it seemed to be getting closer. A chill ran down his spine. James tried to calm himself, telling himself it was just a lighting effect. He stepped back, intending to return to the car, but when he looked around, the fog had thickened to the point where he could barely see the road. A whisper began to echo through the fog. Soft, distant, but clearly not his imagination. James. His heart skipped a beat. How could someone know his name? He turned, trying to find the car, but the headlights had long since gone out. In the fog, he saw other shadows, not just one, but several, moving indistinctly. The whispers grew louder, blending into a creepy chorus. James began to run, but each step seemed to take him deeper into the fog. He shouted, "Who's there?" But there was no answer, only a chuckle echoing from all around. Suddenly, a tall figure appeared right in front of him. It was a man, his face pale with empty eyes and his mouth wide open as if he were screaming. James stepped back, but before he could do anything, the fog engulfed him, so cold that he collapsed to the ground. The next morning, locals found James's car by the lake, the lights still on and the doors open. But James was gone. His camera was found lying on the ground, and when they examined the photos, they were all blurry images of the fog. In the last photo, however, James's face was clearly visible. His eyes were filled with terror, as if he were screaming for help. Since that day, Hollow Creek residents have said that on foggy nights, they sometimes hear footsteps, screams, or see the silhouette of a young man lost in the fog. Some have even said they have heard whispers calling their names, like James's, as if the fog were looking for a new victim. And if you step foot into Hollow Creek on a foggy night, remember their warning: don't stop, don't listen, and never look back. Story 3. A Call from a Stranger. The clock read 11:47 p.m., and Emily was sitting on the sofa, wrapped in a warm blanket, watching an old horror movie. Her small apartment was strangely quiet. No traffic outside, no footsteps from the neighbors. Just the flickering light from the screen and the tense soundtrack of the movie. Her phone rang. Emily jumped. She looked down at the table, saw the screen read unknown number. She hesitated for a moment, then pressed the answer button. "Hello," she said, her voice a little wary. There was silence on the other end of the line. Emily frowned, about to hang up when a voice said, small but serious, "You need to leave the apartment immediately." Her heart stopped. "Excuse me, who's talking? Is this a joke?" "It's not a joke," the voice continued. "You're in danger. Leave now before it's too late." Emily laughed awkwardly. "What danger? I don't know who you are, but don't bother me again." She hung up, put the phone down on the table, and tried to return to the movie. But her mind wouldn't focus. That voice, cold, urgent, kept ringing in her head. Less than a minute later, the phone rang again. This time it was unknown number. Emily didn't want to answer, but her curiosity got the better of her. She picked it up. "You don't understand," the voice said, more urgently. "He's there. You have to leave now." Emily stood up, looking around the apartment. Everything was normal. "Who's here? What are you talking about?" The person on the other end lowered his voice, but the tension didn't lessen. "Do you feel eyes on you? Your bedroom door, is it closed?" Emily shivered. She turned her head to look toward the hallway leading to her bedroom. The bedroom door, which had always been open, was now ajar. A cold chill swept over her. "How did you know?" she asked, her voice trembling. The stranger replied, "You don't have time. Go before he." The line went dead. Emily walked slowly toward the bedroom door, her heart pounding. She didn't remember closing it. She picked up the small flashlight on the table and shone the light through the narrow crack. It was dark inside, not a sound. She took a deep breath, mustering up the courage to push the door open. The bedroom was empty. Everything was in place. The bed was made, the closet was closed, the windows were still locked. She breathed a sigh of relief, but the feeling of unease lingered. Maybe this was just a cruel joke, she told herself. Back in the living room, Emily decided to call the police to report it. But when she picked up the phone, the screen flashed a strange message: no way out. The phone went dead in her hand. Emily ran to the front door, intending to rush out, but found it wouldn't open. The door was locked, though she didn't remember locking it. Her heart pounded as a small noise came from the bedroom, a creaking sound like someone had opened a closet. She didn't want to turn around, but she felt like something was forcing her to face it. She grabbed a knife from the kitchen, her hand shaking, and walked toward the bedroom. As she stood in front of the door, she heard another sound, soft, steady breathing, just behind the closet door. The door slowly opened, but there was nothing but darkness inside. Emily shined her flashlight, and at that moment, her phone vibrated again. She jumped, dropping the flashlight to the floor. The screen read, "Run." She turned, but before she could do anything, a tall figure appeared in the middle of the hallway. His face was hidden in shadow, but his red eyes stared straight at her. He moved closer, each step making the floor creak. Emily screamed, rushing toward the living room window. She used the knife to smash the glass, but it did not break. The footsteps got closer, and the stranger's voice came from the phone again. "He's right behind you." The police found Emily's apartment the next morning. The door was locked from the inside, and there was no sign of a struggle. But Emily was gone, without a trace. Her phone was on the table, the screen showing one final message: "I tried to warn you." Neighbors said that sometimes, at night, they heard the phone vibrate and a distant voice coming from the empty apartment. "Run." Story 5. The Cabin in the Woods. Deep in the Blackwood Forest, where sunlight barely penetrates the dense canopy, there is a small, forgotten cabin. Locals avoid it, saying that those who enter it never return. They say the house once belonged to a family, but no one remembers their names or fates. All that remains is a fearful whisper: "That house eats people up." Tom, an explorer and photographer, doesn't believe in ghost stories. He heard about the house while chatting with a local in a pub near town. "It's just an old house," Tom laughed. "I've been in dozens of haunted places, and nothing but the tedium." The older man shook his head, his eyes serious. "You don't understand. It's like no other place. If you go into the woods, remember, don't step over the threshold." Tom didn't heed the warning. The next morning, with his backpack full of tools, he set out into the woods. In the dim light filtering through the trees, the air was strangely quiet. The birdsong faded away, replaced by a heavy silence that made Tom feel uneasy. After a few hours of walking, he saw it, the cabin. The small house stood in a clearing in the woods, with old, faded wooden walls and a roof that collapsed in one corner. The front door was ajar, as if inviting him in. Tom pulled out his camera and took a few shots from outside. But the longer he looked, the more strange it seemed. The house seemed alive, the walls seemed to breathe, and the darkness inside was unnaturally deep. "Just an illusion," Tom muttered, stepping closer. As he stepped onto the wooden steps, he felt a chill run down his spine. But his curiosity held him back. He pushed the door open and entered. The house was dark inside, though it was still light outside. Tom turned on his flashlight, illuminating the first room. There was nothing but decaying furniture, a wooden table with rickety chairs, a broken fireplace, and a large mirror hanging on the opposite wall. But as soon as the light touched the mirror, he froze. The room reflected in the mirror was not what it actually was. It looked new, bright, and furnished, but in the middle of the room was a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children. They sat there, looking straight at him. Tom turned his head, but the room behind him was empty. He looked back at the mirror, and the family was still there. But this time, their eyes seemed to follow him, and the man seemed to smile slightly. Tom felt the need to leave immediately. He turned and ran for the door, but when he reached it, the door was gone. There was only a blank wooden wall. He shouted, pounding on the wall, but his voice was swallowed by the eerie silence. After a few minutes of futile effort, Tom returned to the room. Everything had changed now. The room was no longer rotten but alive, as in the mirror. But there was no one there, Only a meal laid out on the table, with empty chairs waiting. "This can't be real," Tom whispered. But as he approached the table, he heard giggling, soft but clear. He turned, and this time, the family in the mirror were no longer sitting still. They stood up, walking toward him, smiles crooked and eyes empty. Tom stepped back, but his foot caught something on the floor and he fell. He looked up, seeing the man in the mirror now out, standing right in front of him. "What are you doing here?" The voice rang out, deep and icy. "I just wanted to take a picture," Tom stammered. The man leaned closer to him, his eyes piercing his soul. "You've come in. You can't leave now." Tom screamed, but at that moment, all the light went out. He felt as if he were being pulled into an endless abyss, his body cold and heavy. The next morning, a group of foresters found Tom's backpack lying just outside the cabin. But there was no sign of him. The cabin, as if on cue, was closed, silent in the middle of the woods. When people tried to enter, they found that the door wouldn't open, no matter how hard they pushed. From then on, it was said that on dark nights, you could see a faint light from inside the cabin, and if you listened closely, you could hear giggling, as if the spirits inside were welcoming a new person. And in the mirror, you will see the silhouette of a young man, his terrified face forever trapped, becoming a part of the wooden house. Story 6. Footsteps Behind. When Laura moved to the big city to start her new job, she didn't expect to feel so lonely. She rented a small apartment on the second floor of an old building in a fairly quiet area. Every evening after work, she would go for a walk to relax. The streets with soft yellow lights and the sound of wind blowing through the trees brought a pleasant feeling. But then, those evenings gradually became a nightmare. That night, Laura left the apartment later than usual. The streets were quieter, and the air was a little cold. She walked slowly, listening to the sound of her shoes on the cobblestone sidewalk. But after a few minutes, she noticed something strange. There were other footsteps behind her, soft, regular, and in time with her own. She turned around, but saw no one. The street was empty, lit only by the light from the lampposts and a few cars parked at the curb. Laura smiled wryly, telling herself that the sound was just an echo of her own footsteps. However, as she continued walking, the footsteps rang out again, louder and clearer. Laura stopped abruptly, and the sound stopped as well. A chill ran down her spine, and she didn't dare turn around. She walked faster, almost running, toward the apartment. When she got home, Laura slammed the door shut and sat down on the couch, panting. "It was just my imagination," she reassured herself. But just as she was trying to calm herself, a faint sound came from the hallway outside the apartment. Slow footsteps, as if someone were walking past. She listened, but the footsteps didn't continue. Instead, there was an eerie silence. Laura looked through the peephole in the door, but there was no one. It felt as if all the light outside had been swallowed up by darkness. She decided to go to bed, thinking that with a good night's sleep, everything would be fine. The following nights, things got worse. Wherever she was, on the street, in the elevator, even in her apartment, Laura could feel someone's presence. The footsteps behind her were no longer faint, but clearer, heavier. One time, as she stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, she felt a soft breath brush against the back of her neck. She spun around, knife in hand shaking, but saw no one. The apartment was empty, so quiet she could hear her heart pounding. Determined to find out what was going on, Laura set up a small camera in the living room, pointed at the door. She wanted to know if someone was really watching her or if it was all a figment of her imagination. That night, she sat down to watch the recording before going to bed. At first, everything was normal. The room was quiet, no movement. But in the middle of the recording, something strange happened. The door, though still locked, seemed to shake slightly, as if someone was standing outside and trying to push it in. Then, from the corner of the screen, a blurry figure flashed by, tall, thin, and indistinct. The figure didn't enter the room, but stood still in the doorway, as if waiting. Laura paused the video, her heart stopping. She looked toward the door, but it was still quiet. She decided she wouldn't stay in the apartment another day. The next morning, Laura packed her things, planning to move in with a friend for a while. But as she left the apartment, the feeling returned. The familiar footsteps echoed behind her, soft and steady. She turned around, but the hallway was empty. Trying to suppress her panic, Laura ran down the stairs, but the footsteps seemed to get closer and closer. When she got outside, she stopped, trying to catch her breath. The morning streets were busy. The sunlight felt safe. But then she heard a whisper, soft and close to her ear. "Don't leave." Laura spun around, but there was no one. She screamed, ran to the waiting taxi, jumped in, and told the driver to hurry. She never returned to that apartment, but the footsteps never went away. Wherever she was, in the crowd or in her new room, she heard them, always behind her, always in time with her footsteps. And sometimes, at night, when everything was quiet, she heard soft breathing right next to her bed. The people who lived near Laura's old apartment said that sometimes, at night, they heard footsteps echoing in the hallway, but never saw anyone. And if you listened closely, they said, you could hear a small voice whispering in the darkness. "I'm still here." Story 7. The Dead Man's Chair. In a hidden corner of an old pub in the town of Blackmore, there is a wooden chair that stands out from all the others. Not because it is beautiful or particularly elaborate, but because of the legends surrounding it. The locals call it the Dead Man's Chair, and all avoid it. They say that anyone who sits on the chair will meet with misfortune, sometimes minor accidents, sometimes unexplained deaths. Mark, a young journalist, heard about the chair while researching a story about the legends. Although the locals advised him to stay away, Mark dismissed the rumors as baseless. "This is a great opportunity to make a splash," he told the pub owner, an older man with a worried look in his eyes. "Young man," the owner said, "many people have thought so, but they never come back to tell their stories." Mark chuckled. "No chair can cause death. It's just a coincidence." The owner sighed, but didn't stop Mark. "If you really want to try, don't say I didn't warn you." That night, Mark sat in the shop, observing the chair. It looked completely normal, an old wooden chair with a few scratches on the seat and armrests. But when he looked closely, he noticed something strange. Even though the shop was crowded, no one dared to approach the chair, as if there was an invisible boundary surrounding it. Mark picked up his camera, took a few pictures, and finally decided to try sitting. He put his hand on the back of the chair, felt the cold surface of the wood, and slowly sat down. Nothing happened. He laughed loudly, turned to the owner. "See? Just an ordinary chair." But as soon as the words left his mouth, a cold wind blew through the bar, silencing everyone. The lights in the bar flickered, and the air seemed to freeze. The bar owner just shook his head and whispered, "You shouldn't have done that." That night, on his way home, Mark felt something was wrong. He drove down a deserted street, and in his rearview mirror, he thought he saw a shadow pass by. He turned around, but there was no one in the silent night. Suddenly, the car radio crackled, then turned into a whisper, broken voice. "Why? You sit there." Mark froze. He turned off the radio, but the voice continued, this time clearer. "You shouldn't have." He stepped on the gas, and the car sped forward, but the feeling of being watched did not go away. When he got to his apartment, Mark locked the door and sat panting in the chair. It was just a crazy joke, he told himself. But sleep did not come easily. That night, He dreamed that he was sitting on the chair again, surrounded by an empty, dark space. A figure appeared in the distance, tall, thin, and its face hidden in the darkness. The figure approached, and when it was only a few feet away from Mark, it spoke in a cold voice. "You are sitting in a place that is not meant for you." Mark woke up with a start, drenched in sweat. But the most terrifying thing was that when he looked down at his hand, he saw a dark handprint imprinted deep into his skin, as if someone had grabbed him. In the following days, everything around Mark began to go downhill. His computer kept crashing, the pictures of the chair disappeared from his memory card, and he often heard footsteps in his apartment, even though he lived alone. The climax was a small accident when he slipped and fell in the bathroom, even though the floor was completely dry. When he returned to the pub to confront his boss, Mark told him everything, his voice filled with despair. "What must I do to end this?" he asked, eyes full of weariness. The innkeeper shook his head. "No one has ever escaped the curse of the chair. The souls trapped in it do not like to share their space. You better prepare for the worst." On the last night, Mark heard a knock on the door. Soft at first, then more intense. When he opened the door, the hallway was empty, but a cold air filled the apartment. He turned back to the room and saw it, the chair from the tavern, sitting in the middle of the living room. Mark screamed, but could not move. The chair seemed to groan, and a dark figure began to form above it, with a distorted face, empty eyes, and a malicious smile. The last anyone heard of Mark was the scream echoing from his apartment. When the police arrived, the room was completely empty, with no trace of him, except for a wooden chair sitting in the middle of the room, as if waiting for someone to sit down. Today, the chair is still in the Blackmoor pub, and no one dares to go near it. But if you walk through the door of the pub, sometimes you can hear a chuckle echoing from the corner of the room, and a voice whispering, "Sit down. I'm waiting." Story 8. The Curse of the Woodcutter. The Shadowwood Forest on the edge of Willowvale has always been shrouded in a gloomy atmosphere. Locals tell of strange phenomena that occur there. Laughter echoing from the darkness, shadowy figures flitting between the trees, and especially the appearance of a spirit, the cursed woodcutter. The story goes that, more than a century ago, a woodcutter named Elias lived in a small house in the middle of the Shadowwood Forest. Elias was a strong, hard-working man and was respected by the townspeople. But everything changed when an accident happened. While cutting wood, a falling tree killed Elias' family, his wife and young son. Too heartbroken, Elias gave up his job, lived in isolation in his log house, and gradually lost his mind. It is said that he began to converse with the shadows, calling upon supernatural forces to seek revenge on the forest that took his family. One day, the townspeople no longer saw Elias. When they went into the forest to search, they found only an empty house, with the words, "These woods are mine. Go away, or suffer my fate." From then on, people avoided Shadowwood, but Elias's curse remained. Those who entered this forest often never returned, or if they were lucky enough to survive, they became insane, haunted by Elias' laughter and eyes. Sam, a paranormal researcher, heard about this story from a friend in Willowvale. Being curious by nature, Sam decided to go to Shadowwood to verify. Despite the warnings of the locals, he thought these were just fabrications. "This is a great opportunity to gather material for my book," Sam thought to himself, shouldering his backpack and taking his camera with him. As he entered the edge of the forest, the atmosphere changed immediately. The sky turned gray, and a thick fog crept across the ground. The trees seemed taller, denser, and all the sounds of nature, birds chirping, wind rustling through leaves, had disappeared, leaving a deadly silence. Sam walked deeper into the forest, filming and taking notes on this strange feeling. But the further he went, the more he felt like someone was watching him. A heavy feeling, like dozens of eyes were watching from between the trees. Sometimes he heard footsteps, but every time he turned around, he saw only darkness and trees. About an hour later, Sam discovered an old wooden house, hidden behind giant oak trees. It was definitely where Elias had lived. The rotten wooden door was ajar, and it was pitch black inside. Sam turned on his flashlight, illuminating the small room. Everything was still there: the table, the chair, and a large axe standing in the corner. But what made him shiver was the hand-carved words on the wall: "You are not allowed here." As Sam entered, the air turned cold. He turned on the camera, recording everything, but as soon as he touched the axe, a laugh rang out. Not a happy laugh, but a low, distorted laugh that echoed from all around. "Welcome." A cold voice rang out from the darkness. Sam turned around, startled, but saw no one. Outside the house, the fog was getting thicker. Sam decided to leave, but when he stepped outside, he realized he had no idea which way led to the forest. All the paths had disappeared, leaving only the trees surrounding him. He turned on his flashlight, shining the light around, and then he saw it. A tall figure stood in the fog, holding a large axe. Even though he couldn't see the face, Sam knew it was Elias. His eyes were red and full of hatred, seemingly piercing the darkness to stare straight at him. "Elias," Sam stammered, trying to step back. But every step he took was followed by another, heavy and steady. Elias didn't walk. He crawled through the darkness, as if he were part of the forest. "You disturbed my sleep," Elias said, his voice low and cold. "Now you'll stay here forever." Sam started to run, but there was no escape. The trees seemed to close the path, and the mist wrapped around his legs, pulling him down. His camera fell from his hand, capturing the last image: Elias's silhouette standing over him, his smile twisted, his axe raised. A few weeks later, a rescue team found Sam's camera near the edge of the forest. But no one could find him. When the footage was played back, only his final screams were heard, before the cameras cut out. Willowvale residents say that on moonless nights, you can hear twisted laughter and the sound of axes chopping wood echoing from the woods. And if you dare to enter the shadow wood, know that Elias is still there, waiting for those foolish enough to trespass on his domain. Story 9. The Clown Statue. The story begins when the Wilson family moves into an old house on the outskirts of Graysville. The house is a beautiful Victorian house, with large rooms and ornate furniture. However, there is one thing in the house that makes the family feel uncomfortable: a 2-foot-tall porcelain clown statue placed right above the fireplace in the living room. The statue is exquisitely carved, but there is something wrong with its eyes. Too bright, too real, as if watching everyone in the room. Although they feel uncomfortable, the Wilsons decide to leave the statue alone, thinking it is just a part of the history of the house. Things start to get strange on the first night. While cleaning the living room, Mrs. Wilson swears that the statue has changed position. It is no longer facing the front door, but is instead facing the sofa. "I must have imagined it," she tells herself, adjusting the statue. But when she turned away, she felt a chill run down her spine, as if someone was watching her. In the following days, strange things continued to happen. The lights in the living room flickered for no reason, and everyone in the family had the feeling that the statue was moving. Sometimes it turned its head toward the stairs, sometimes it looked toward the kitchen. But no one in the house wanted to admit it, thinking it was just an illusion. The climax came one evening when her little daughter Sophie was playing in the living room. She ran upstairs, her face pale, her eyes filled with fear. "Mommy, the statue isn't moving. It's waving at me," Sophie screamed, hugging Mrs. Wilson tightly. "It's not like that, honey," Mrs. Wilson tried to reassure her. But when she went down to the living room to check, she noticed something horrifying. The statue's arm, which had been straight, was now bent, as if it was raising its hand in greeting. Mr. Wilson, initially skeptical, decided to check the statue the following night. He measured it with a measuring tape and took photographs to make sure it hadn't changed position or shape. But when he reviewed the photos the next morning, everything in the room was the same, except for the statue. In each photo, the statue's eyes seemed to grow brighter, and its mouth twisted into a wider, more twisted smile. Growing increasingly uneasy, the Wilsons decided to move the statue from their home. Mr. Wilson called a friend who worked at a museum to appraise it and possibly sell it. When the friend arrived, he immediately backed away, his face pale. "You shouldn't keep this," he said, his voice shaking. "I've read about it. This statue is said to be cursed. It is said that the spirit of an evil clown was sealed in here after he was executed for murder. Whoever owns it will be haunted by it." Mr. Wilson, though not entirely convinced, decided to immediately take the statue out of the house. But when he tried to lift it, he felt an unusual weight, as if something was trying to cling to the floor. In the end, it took 2 men to get it to the car. That night, the Wilson family felt relieved, thinking that everything was over. But in the middle of the night, they were awakened by strange noises coming from the living room. When they went down to check, the whole family froze. The statue, which had been taken away, was now standing on the fireplace, its eyes glowing in the dark and its mouth open as if laughing. For a terrifying moment, they heard laughter. Not human laughter, but a high-pitched, echoing laughter that echoed throughout the house. The Wilsons left the house the next day. The house was put up for sale, but no one dared to buy it. Locals said that at night, they could still see a faint light coming from the living room, and if they stood near the window, they could hear the laughter, and the statue's eyes watched them through the glass. Story 10. The Secret Room. The Fairchild family mansion has stood tall on Windermere Hill for over a century. Built by the family's founder, a wealthy merchant, the mansion is majestic with its gray stone walls and dark red tiled roof. But among all the grand rooms and carpeted hallways, there is one door that is always closed. The Secret Room. It is said that the room has never been opened since the house was built. The first owner of the mansion ordered it locked and forbade anyone to enter. Legend has it that inside the room lies a terrible secret, one that should not be awakened. When Edward, the young heir to the Fairchild family, returns to the mansion after his parents' death, he is drawn to the mysterious door. It is located at the end of the second-floor hallway, with an old brass lock and strange carvings in the wood. The old butler, Mr. Harris, warned him, "Sir, some secrets are better left alone." But Edward did not believe in ghost stories. He thought that the room only contained old objects or family memories that his father did not want to talk about. Curiosity urged him to explore. Late one night, when the house was quiet, Edward decided to open the door himself. He brought a flashlight and a bunch of antique keys that Mr. Harris had given him. Before the door, his hand shook slightly as he inserted the key into the lock. After a small click, the lock opened. The door opened slowly, emitting an eerie creaking sound. Inside, the room was immersed in thick darkness. A strong musty smell rose, and the cold air seemed to have just entered another world. Edward turned on the flashlight, illuminating the room. It was smaller than he had imagined. Inside was an old wooden table, a chair covered in rotten velvet, and on the wall hung a large painting, covered with a red cloth. But the strangest thing was the symbols carved into the floor, strange shapes and words in a language he did not understand. Edward approached the painting. He reached out and pulled the red cloth away. Behind it was a portrait, a man in a black cloak, his eyes deep and haunting. It seemed that the painting was more than just a work of art. The man's eyes seemed alive, following his every move. Suddenly, a cold gust of air swept over Edward. and the door behind him slammed shut. His heart pounded, and he rushed towards the door, trying to open it, but to no avail. The room seemed to be a trap, trapping him. Inside the room, the light from Edward's flashlight began to flicker. He heard whispering, soft at first, but gradually growing louder. Whispers rose from all around, blending into a low, cold voice. "You woke me." Edward turned, and he saw that the painting had changed. The man in the painting was smiling now, a crooked, malicious smile. The eyes in the painting were no longer following him. They were staring into a corner of the room. He shone his flashlight toward the corner and saw a shadow forming. It was the shape of a man, but his body seemed to melt into the darkness around him. He walked toward Edward, each step making the floor shake. "You shouldn't have opened this door," the shadow said, its voice coming from nowhere. "There's no way out now." The next morning, Mr. Harris didn't see Edward. When he went upstairs to look for him, the door to the secret room was still closed. Despite his best efforts, he couldn't open it. In the days that followed, townspeople reported hearing screams coming from the mansion at night, along with strange whispers. And sometimes, those who passed by the Fairchild house at night swore they saw a faint light coming from the secret room, along with the shadow of a man standing behind the window, his eyes glowing in the darkness. The Fairchild house is now abandoned, and no one dares to go near it. The door to the secret room remains closed, as if waiting for another curious person to cross the threshold. And if you stand very quietly outside, you can hear a whisper from inside. "Come in. I'm waiting." Story 11. The Ghost Painting. At an auction in an old mansion, Anna, a young art collector, is fascinated by a strange painting. The painting depicts a small house in the middle of a dense forest, surrounded by a dim light like an eternal twilight. Although it looks gloomy, the painting has an irresistible beauty, as if it has a special charm. The auctioneer says that this painting belongs to the Blackwood family, a family famous for its ghost stories. "I don't know much about its origin," he says, "but it is rumored to be alive." Anna smiles, thinking that it is just a trick to increase the value of the painting. She decides to buy it and hang it in her living room. From the first night, Anna notices that something is wrong. When she walks through the living room, she feels like the painting is watching her. But she tells herself that it is just her imagination. The next morning, however, she noticed something strange. The painting had changed. The house in the painting, which had stood still in the middle of the forest, now had a faint light coming from the window, as if someone were inside. Anna frowned. "I must not have noticed," she muttered, trying to shake off her unease. Over the next few days, the painting kept changing. The light in the window grew brighter, and one day she saw a faint figure standing in front of the house, staring out into the forest. Her heart pounded, but she could not tear her eyes away from the painting. Then one night, Anna woke up from a strange dream. In the dream, she found herself standing in front of the house in the painting. The door slowly opened, and a voice rang out, cold and distant. "Come in, Anna. I am waiting." Anna woke up, drenched in sweat. But the nightmare was only the beginning. The next morning, when she entered the living room, she found the painting had completely changed. The house was no longer in the woods, but surrounded by a familiar road. It was the road that led to her apartment. Panic rose in her heart, but Anna decided to investigate. She took the painting to an art expert for examination. When he saw the painting, he was bewildered. "This is not an ordinary oil painting," he said. "There is something wrong." The brushstrokes seemed to change on their own, as if it were alive. That night, the painting changed for the last time. The house in the painting disappeared, replaced by an image of Anna's own living room. Every detail was exactly reproduced: the gray sofa, the small glass table, and most importantly, the painting itself hanging on the wall. Anna felt her blood run cold. When she looked more closely, a figure appeared in the painting. It was her, standing in front of the painting, just as she was at that moment. Suddenly, the lights in the room went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and Anna felt a cold breath right behind her. She turned around, but saw no one. When she turned the lights back on, the painting was empty. No house, no image of her, just a deep black background. The next morning, Anna's friend came to visit, but she was nowhere to be found. The apartment was quiet, except for the painting on the wall. In the painting, the small house in the middle of the forest appeared again, and this time, a figure stood in front of the door, her face panicked. It was Anna. From then on, the painting continued to change, capturing the images of those who were haunted by it. It was said that if you saw yourself in the painting, there was no way to escape the fate of being swallowed by it. And now, if you happen to see a painting of a small house in the middle of the forest, be careful. Don't look at it for too long, because when it starts to change, you will never come back. Story 12. The Crying Statue, Tears of Blood. The ancient church on the outskirts of Ravenhill is famous for its dark Gothic architecture and spooky legends. But what makes this place even more special is the statue in the grounds, the Weeping Virgin Mary. The statue is nearly 2 meters tall, carved from white marble, with eyes looking down in sadness. Locals say that whenever someone in the town dies mysteriously, the statue will cry tears of blood. Laura, a young reporter who specializes in writing about mysterious phenomena, decides to investigate the story. When she arrives at the church, she is led to the statue by the priest, an elderly man with a tired look in his eyes. The statue stands in a quiet corner of the churchyard, surrounded by dense trees and ancient tombs. People here believe that the statue is cursed, the priest says. Its tears are a sign of misfortune. Laura didn't believe the legends. She took pictures of the statue, took careful notes, and asked about the events. When was the last time the statue cried? She asked. 3 months ago, the priest replied. A young man in town went missing. The next day, the statue cried tears of blood. Laura felt a chill, but her curiosity kept her going. She decided to stay in town for a few days to investigate further. That evening, Laura sat in her small hotel room, reviewing the photos she had taken that day. When she zoomed in on the statue, she noticed something strange. In the dim light, the statue's eyes seemed to be streaming with a faint stream of water, even though the statue had been completely dry when she took the picture. It must be just the lighting, she told herself, but a sense of unease began to creep in. The next day, Laura returned to the church to examine the statue again. This time, she brought her camera to record everything. When she arrived, she noticed that the space around the statue had become colder, despite the warm weather outside. In the dim light, she saw faint red streaks on the statue's cheeks, as if it had been crying. She turned on the camera, but as she got closer, a cold breeze swept past, and suddenly, a whisper sounded from somewhere around her. The voice was soft, but full of sorrow. "Free me!" Laura turned around, but saw no one. Only the statue stood still. Its eyes seemed to stare at her. That night, Laura dreamed of the statue. In the dream, the statue was no longer standing still, but walked away from the stone pedestal, each step slow but heavy. Its eyes were bloodshot, and its voice sounded clearer. "You saw me. Now you can't escape." She woke up, drenched in sweat. But what terrified her most was that when she looked down at her desk, the photo she had taken of the statue had now changed. In the photo, the statue's eyes were red, and blood was flowing down the pedestal. The next day, Laura went to the church to see the priest, but he was not there. As she approached the statue, she noticed that blood had appeared on the statue, flowing from its eyes to its feet. Frightened, she tried to leave, but somehow her legs seemed to be held back. Suddenly, a cold laugh rang out, and the voice from her dream returned. "You can't leave. Stay with me." The statue, which had been motionless, now moved slightly. Its arms were raised, as if reaching for Laura. Panicked, she ran out of the church, not daring to look back. Laura left the town that night, but her dreams continued to haunt her. She dreamed of the statue. Each time it got closer, its bloodshot eyes filled with anger. And in reality, bloodstains began to appear on the mirror, on the desk, and even on her clothes. She realized that, even though she had left Ravenhill, the curse of the statue had followed her. The people of Ravenhill said that the statue was still there, in the churchyard. And whenever someone dared to look into its eyes for too long, tears of blood would begin to flow, and that person would never be at peace again. Story 13. The Old Lighthouse. Perched on a towering cliff, the Blackstone Lighthouse stands tall and majestic, overlooking the vast ocean. For centuries, it guided ships away from dangerous reefs. But since its abandonment at the turn of the last century, it has become a place no one dares to approach. Locals say that the ghost of the last lighthouse keeper, Thomas Gray, still haunts the place, guarding the ever-changing light. Emma, a young investigative journalist, decides to write about the lighthouse and the legends surrounding it. Despite warnings from many, she sets out for Blackstone, bringing along a camera and a tape recorder to document everything. She believes that the stories about ghosts are just anecdotes made up to scare the curious. When she arrives, she finds the lighthouse standing alone against a gray sky. The cold sea breeze blew past, carrying the salty scent of the sea. The old wooden door was locked, but it wasn't hard for her to find her way inside. As soon as she stepped through the threshold, she felt the cold air enveloping her, as if the lighthouse was not only abandoned but also haunted by something inexplicable. Inside the lighthouse was a spiral iron staircase leading to the top of the tower. The light from the small windows was weak, revealing rust stains and cobwebs. Emma began filming, describing the state of the place. But as she climbed the first few steps, a small sound rang out, like footsteps, slow and steady, echoing from the top of the tower. She stopped, turned her head to look down, but there was no one. Just an echo, she reassured herself, continuing to climb. But the footsteps seemed to follow her. Each step was answered by another, heavier sound from behind. When she reached the top, Emma found the lighthouse room intact, but dust covered everything. The rotating lighthouse lens was still motionless in the middle of the room, but she felt as if it were watching her, like a giant eye. She turned on the tape recorder and asked loudly, "Thomas Gray, if you are here, give me a sign." At first there was nothing but the wind whistling through the windows. But then a deep voice came from the tape recorder, "You should not be here." Emma froze. She turned around, but the room was empty. Still, she couldn't take her eyes off the small mirror hanging on the wall. In it, she saw a faint silhouette, a tall man in an old coat, standing in the corner. His eyes had no whites, just a deep black. In a panic, Emma rushed down the stairs, but each step seemed longer, and the footsteps behind her grew closer. When she reached the lower level, she tried to open the door, but the wooden door was now locked from the outside. "You cannot leave," the voice said behind her. Emma turned and saw Thomas Gray standing right in front of her, his face twisted, his eyes black with hatred. "This light is mine. You have no right to take it away." She screamed, took the camera and threw it at him, and suddenly the door flew open. Without hesitation, Emma rushed out, running towards the shore, not daring to look back. When she got back to town, Emma checked the footage on the camera. But all she could capture were blurry images, shadows, and strange streaks of light. However, the voice on the recorder was still clear. "I warned you." She finished writing the article but never dared to return to the lighthouse. Locals say that since her trip, the light from the Blackstone Lighthouse, which had been extinguished for years, has begun to flicker again on stormy nights, as if Thomas Gray were still doing his job, guiding lost ships. But if you dare to approach, never enter. Because once you do, you will never leave, like the sailors who lost their lives at sea and the foolish curious before you. Story 14. The Forgotten Grave. In the old cemetery on the outskirts of Elder Moor, there is a grave hidden under an ancient oak tree. There is no headstone, no name, just a simple stone covered in moss. The locals call it the Forgotten Grave. They say the soul buried there has never found rest, because no one remembers its name, its story, or even why it was forgotten. Clara, a historian, came to Elder Moor to write about the town's ancient ruins. When she heard about the grave, she was immediately interested. "Doesn't anyone know who lies there?" she asked the cemetery manager, a stoic old man. "No one dares to come near," he whispered. "They say the spirit is looking for someone to tell its story to. But if you're not careful, you'll be the one to tell it forever." Clara laughed, thinking it was just a folk tale to scare tourists. The next day, she decided to visit the grave. As she entered the cemetery, Clara felt a heavy atmosphere, as if the place had been frozen in time. As she approached the grave, she noticed that the space around her seemed strangely quiet. No birds chirping, no wind blowing through the leaves. The grave, simple and covered in moss, looked as if it had been forgotten by time. She carefully brushed away the moss, hoping to find a clue, but underneath the moss was only smooth stone. There was no name, no date. Clara turned on the tape recorder, telling herself that she would record everything. "What do you want from me?" she asked loudly, half jokingly. Suddenly, a cold wind blew by, and the tape recorder emitted a strange buzzing sound. When she checked again, a faint voice came from the device. "Find me." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She turned on her computer, searched all the information about Elder Moor Cemetery and the mysterious grave, but found nothing but a few vague notes. They said it was the burial place of an unknown person, an outcast or a forgotten person. The more Clara researched, the more drawn to the story she felt. She decided to return to the grave the next night, bringing a flashlight and a video camera to record anything. When she arrived at the cemetery at midnight, Clara realized that everything was different. The faint moonlight illuminated the grave, and she felt as if the surrounding graves were looking at her. When she reached the forgotten grave, she turned on the flashlight, and this time she saw something horrifying. On the surface of the stone, lines began to appear, not in ink or engraving, but as if written in blood. The words were shaky, distorted, but clear. "I am James. Don't let me be forgotten." Clara stepped back, but a voice rang out behind her, cold and desperate. "You called me." She turned and saw a shadowy figure, a man with a gaunt face, eyes sunken and full of pain. "You must tell my story. Don't let me disappear again," he said, his voice pleading but tinged with a hidden threat. Clara tried to run away, but as she stepped out of the cemetery, she realized that James's shadow was still following her, his empty eyes following her every step. When she got home, she turned on the video camera and played back the footage, but all that was recorded was her own screams and the image of a pair of eyes glowing in the darkness. In the days that followed, Clara was haunted by James's shadow. Wherever she was, she felt his presence, in mirrors, in dreams, and even in the darkness of her room at night. Eventually, Clara had no choice but to write down James's story. But the problem was, she didn't know what that story was. A month later, the townspeople of Elder Moor found Clara's house empty. Her camera was still there, and in the final footage, she was seen standing in front of the forgotten tomb, reading a story in a voice no one could understand, before the screen went black. It was said that if you went to the forgotten tomb at night, you could hear Clara's voice, repeating a story no one remembered, as if she had become part of the curse, forever telling the story no one could hear. Story 15. The Laughing Ghost. The small town of Greystone is usually peaceful, but on moonless nights, everyone locks their doors and draws their curtains. They fear a strange sound that appears when darkness falls: laughter. It is not the happy laughter of humans, but a distorted, sharp, and eerie sound that echoes through the streets. Jenna, a young teacher who has just moved to town, has never heard of this legend. When she hears her students talk about the strange laughter, she just smiles and says it is a child's imagination. But as night falls, a feeling of unease begins to creep in. The small house she rents is near the edge of town, where stories about laughter are most often told. The first night, while reading in the living room, Jenna suddenly hears a sound in the distance. At first, it is faint and hard to notice, like the wind whistling through the trees. But gradually, the sound became clearer. It was laughter. At first, Jenna thought someone was walking by. She opened the window and looked out, but the street was completely empty. The laughter continued, long and intermittent, as if coming from somewhere very close, but the location was unclear. She closed the window, reassuring herself that she was imagining things. But the laughter did not stop. The next morning, Jenna told the landlady about it. The landlady's face immediately paled, and she whispered, "Did you hear it? Get out of here before it's too late." Jenna smiled awkwardly, trying not to show her concern. But as she dug deeper, she discovered the story of the laughing ghost. Legend has it that, many years ago, a circus came to Greystone to perform. Among the performers was a clown named Jonathan, famous for his strange smile and laugh. But behind the funny exterior, Jonathan was a dark person. It was discovered that he had killed people for his own pleasure, and one rainy night, the townspeople dragged him off the circus wagon and executed him right on the edge of town. From then on moonless nights, Jonathan's laughter still rang out, as if he were looking for lost souls to drag into the darkness. The second night, the laughter became clearer, closer. Jenna decided to record the sound with her phone. When she played it back, she noticed something strange. In the recording, the laughter did not come from just one direction, but seemed to fill the entire room. She tried to ignore it, but that night, she had a terrifying dream. In the dream, she found herself standing in the middle of a deserted street. A thick fog covered everything, and laughter rang out from everywhere. A blurry figure appeared in front of her, a man in an old clown costume, with a pale face and hollow eyes. "Can you laugh at me?" he asked, his voice twisted and haunting. Jenna couldn't answer. She froze as his twisted smile widened, almost tearing her face apart. His laughter rang out, growing louder, sharp as broken glass, and she woke up. The next morning, Jenna decided to leave town, but when she stepped outside, she saw something horrifying. There was a faint, bloody handprint on the living room window, and underneath it was scrawled, "You can't run." She jumped into her car and drove away, but when she reached the edge of town, the car suddenly died. Thick fog covered the road, and in the distance, laughter rang out. No longer a twisted laugh from afar, but right in her ear. "Can you smile at me?" the voice said from the back seat. Jenna screamed, turning around, but the back seat was empty. The laughter continued, and the last time anyone heard her was a scream that echoed through the mist. The people of Greystone said that on moonless nights, if you passed the edge of town, you could hear the laughter echoing in the distance. And if you didn't run, you would see a shadowy figure in the mist, eyes empty and a smile that never faded. Story 16. The Screaming Window. On a deserted street in the town of Hollowcrest, there is an abandoned house that no one dares to approach. The house is located at the end of the road, with cracked walls and a rotten roof. But what makes it famous throughout the town is not its gloomy appearance, but a large window on the second floor, which the locals call the Screaming Window. It is said that every night, when darkness falls, from that window comes a piercing, painful scream, making anyone who hears it shiver. No one knows why the scream appears, but many say it is associated with a tragedy that happened in the house decades ago. Martha, a paranormal researcher, decides to go to Hollowcrest to discover the secret of the house. When she asks the locals, she only receives worried looks and advice to stay away. But Martha didn't believe in ghost stories, and her curiosity drove her to investigate. She arrived at the house in the afternoon, when the sunlight was still shining through the trees. From the outside, the second-floor window looked like a gloomy eye watching everything. The front door of the house was rotten, and it wasn't difficult for her to enter. Inside, it was a stuffy space, full of dust and cobwebs. Martha walked up the stairs to the second floor. The stairs creaked under each step, and the air grew colder. As she approached the window, she noticed that the wall around it was covered in strange black streaks, like traces of fire. She placed the recording device and camera near the window, determined to record any phenomena that occurred. But as night fell, things became even stranger. The house was plunged into darkness, and the wind whistling through the cracks in the windows created an ominous sound. Suddenly, a scream rang out, tearing the silence. Martha was startled. The scream was unlike anything she had ever heard. It was full of pain, as if someone were in excruciating pain. The scream lasted for a few seconds, then died away, leaving a deadly silence. She checked her recording equipment, but it only recorded absolute silence. When she turned back to look at the window, she saw something strange. The reflection in the glass was not an image of the room, but the sight of a woman standing in front of the window, her face contorted in pain. Martha turned around, but there was no one there. The next day, she learned more about the history of the house. It turned out that many years ago, this place had belonged to a wealthy family. The wife, Amelia, was said to have jumped from that window after a big fight with her husband, leaving behind a bitter suicide note. However, some say that she did not commit suicide, but was pushed down by her husband in a fit of rage. Since then, the window where Amelia fell was said to be where her soul was trapped, unable to find rest. The second night, Martha decided to stay longer. This time, she heard not only screams, but also whispers coming from all over the house. "What did I do to deserve this?" a weak female voice rang out. Martha felt a chill down her spine. She walked towards the window, and a sudden strong wind blew past, causing her to fall. When she raised her head, she saw a blurry figure standing right outside the window, staring at her. "Are you Amelia?" Martha asked, her voice trembling. The figure did not answer, only looked at her with empty eyes, then disappeared. The next morning, Martha left the house with a heavy feeling. She checked the footage, but all she could see was the empty room and the whistling wind. But as she slowed down, she saw a fleeting moment, Amelia's face, eyes full of rage, and a clear whisper, "He pushed me." The people of Hollowcrest said that, even after Martha left, the screams from the window continued to echo every moonless night. And sometimes, if you looked closely, you could see Amelia's shadow, standing there, waiting for someone to hear her story, or to share her fate. Story 17. The Girl in the Photo. Diane is a freelance photographer living on the outskirts of town. One day, while wandering through an antique market, she comes across an old photo framed in a wooden frame. It is a black and white photo of a young girl in a white dress standing in a garden full of roses. The girl's face has a mysterious beauty, with deep eyes and a gentle smile. Diane doesn't know why she is attracted to the photo. The shop owner, an older woman, smiles slightly when she sees her staring at it. "This is the only remaining photo of a long-lost woman," she says, her voice even. "They say she had a tragic fate. If you want, I'll sell it for cheap." Without thinking much, Diane buys the photo and takes it home, hanging it in her office. At first, the photo was just a strange decoration. But after a few days, Diane began to feel that something was wrong. She noticed that the eyes of the girl in the photo always seemed to be looking straight at her, no matter what corner of the room she was standing in. One night, while editing a photo on her computer, she accidentally glanced at the photo. Her heart stopped. She swore that the photo had changed. The girl's smile was no longer gentle, but twisted, more mysterious. The following days, things got stranger. One morning, Diane noticed small streaks of mud on the floor, leading from the front door to the study. She checked the door, but it was still locked. What frightened her most was that when she looked at the photo again, the girl's shoes were now covered in mud. She tried to calm herself down, thinking that she had overworked herself and was imagining things. But that night, as she slept, she was awakened by a gentle knock on the door. At first she thought it was the wind, but the knocking continued, steady and coming from the study. Carrying a flashlight, Diane walked slowly toward the study. When she opened the door, she froze in place. The photo was now blank. The girl was gone. At that moment, she felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. She spun around, and there was the girl in the photo. She stood there, wearing a white dress, her face exactly like the photo, but with empty eyes and pale skin. "Who are you?" Diane stammered. The girl didn't answer. Instead, an eerie smile appeared on her face, and a whisper rang out, like the wind whistling through the room. "Now it's your turn to be in the picture." Diane screamed and fell backwards. When she woke up, she found herself on the floor, the photo still hanging on the wall. But this time, the girl was back in the photo, and standing next to her was Diane herself, her face full of panic. When Diane's friends came to find her a few days later, the house was empty. The photo was still on the wall, but now the girl in the photo was no longer alone. There were two women standing in the photo, and one of them was Diane, her eyes wide with unquenchable fear. It is said that if you stare at the photo for too long, you will hear a whisper, and if you do not look away, you will become part of the photo forever. Story 18. The Broken Clock. The Ellison family home, located in the quiet suburb of Willowbrook, has stood tall for generations. One of the family's most important heirlooms is an old wall clock, handcrafted in the late 19th century. The clock has a gold-plated dial, intricate Roman numerals, and a smooth pendulum that has been moving non-stop for over 100 years. But one fateful day, the clock stopped, its hour and minute hands both stopping at 3:15 a.m., the exact moment a terrible tragedy occurred. Tina Ellison, a descendant of the family, decided to return to the old house after many years of abandonment to sort out the family's assets. She had heard about the clock from her grandmother, but this was the first time she saw it in person. The clock hung in the living room, its glass face covered in dust but still retaining its ancient beauty. The hands of the clock stopped at 3:15, and the pendulum was motionless. Tina felt a strange sensation as she stood before the clock, as if time had stopped in the room. "It's just an old clock," she told herself, but the uneasiness still clung to her. On her first night in the house, Tina was awakened by a strange sound, a ticking sound, regular and clear. She jumped up, looked at her watch. 3:15 a.m. When she went down to the living room, she saw something unbelievable. The old clock, which had stopped running, was now running again, the pendulum swinging slowly. But what was even more frightening was that the ticking sound did not come from the clock alone, but seemed to echo from every corner of the room. The next morning, Tina called a clockmaker to check it out. The watchmaker, an experienced old man, looked at the clock and frowned. "This clock should not be working," he said. "The mechanism inside is completely broken. There's no way it can work." The old man advised Tina to throw the clock away, but she refused. "This is part of my family," she said, though she began to feel uneasy. That evening, Tina found an old diary of her grandmother's in the house's library. The yellowed pages told the story of a terrible night 50 years ago. At exactly 3:15 a.m., Tina's great-grandfather, a violent and hot-tempered man, had been murdered in this very house. He was found dead on the living room floor, his face twisted in fear, his hands clawing at the floor, and the wall clock had stopped when he died. "The clock stopped to mark the moment of the crime," Tina's grandmother wrote. "But I feel that his spirit never left." The next night, the ticking grew louder, faster, and the whole house seemed to shake with each beat. Tina lay in bed, unable to sleep. Suddenly, she heard a whisper coming from the living room. Her heart pounded, but she summoned the courage to go downstairs to check. The room was dark, but the clock glowed dimly in the darkness. The hands moved quickly, passing the hours, the minutes, as if being pushed by an invisible force. When it stopped, there was a knock on the door, not from the front door, but from the living room. Tina turned her head, and she saw it, a shadowy figure standing beside the clock, eyes shining in the darkness. It was a man, his face pale and distorted, just like the description in Grandma's diary. "You woke me," the figure said, her voice as cold as the winter wind. "Your time has come." The next morning, neighbors called the police after hearing screams coming from the house. When the police arrived, they found the living room completely empty, except for the clock. The clock's hands had stopped at exactly 3:15 a.m., and Tina was nowhere to be found. Residents said that every night, if you stood outside the house, you could hear the ticking sound coming from the living room, even though the clock had stopped. And if you looked through the window, you could see the silhouette of a young woman standing next to the clock, her eyes wide with fear. Story 19. The Ghostly Black Dog. In the remote countryside near the village of Blackmore, people often tell of a mysterious creature that appears whenever there is a tragedy. The ghostly black dog. It is a large dog, black as darkness, with eyes as red as burning coals. The locals say that if you see it, it means death is near, and no one can escape it. James, a writer specializing in folk legends, decides to go to Blackmore to find out about this ghostly dog. When he hears the story from the villagers, he just laughs, thinking it is just a legend to scare children. "That's what they say," James said to the innkeeper. "I've never heard of a dog that can bring death." The innkeeper, an old man with a serious look, just shook his head. "You better be careful, boy. That dog is no joke. It's no ordinary animal. If you see it, run away. But no matter how you run, it will find you." On his first night in the village, James decided to walk around the forest near the village, hoping to find some traces or hear more stories from the villagers. The forest was covered in a thick fog, and the dim moonlight was just enough to illuminate a small path leading deeper into the forest. About half an hour later, as he was taking notes, James heard a low growl. At first, he thought it was just a stray dog, but when the growl rang out again, he felt a chill run down his spine. When he turned his head, he saw it. In the middle of the fog, a huge black dog stood still, its red eyes staring straight at him. Its fur was shiny like tar, and its mouth was turned back to reveal sharp white teeth. James froze for a moment, but his instincts told him to run. He ran towards the village, his heart pounding. But no matter how fast he ran, the dog's heavy footsteps could be heard not far behind. When he reached the inn's door, the footsteps stopped abruptly. He turned around, but the dog was gone, as if it had never been there. James's whole body trembled, and he told the innkeeper the story. "You saw it," the old man said, his voice filled with worry. "It has marked you. Now you must be careful, for something bad is about to happen." The next day, James went to the old village library to research the legend further. He discovered that the black dog had been mentioned for decades. According to records, it appeared before tragic events, a great fire, a massacre, or an unnatural death. Those who saw it met a terrible fate. James, though still skeptical, could not deny the haunting red eyes he had seen. That night, he decided to leave the village, but his car wouldn't start. He returned to the inn, but the air there was now heavy, as if something invisible was waiting. Around midnight, the familiar roar sounded again, this time right outside his window. James lifted the curtains and saw the black dog standing outside, its red eyes staring at him. But this time, it wasn't alone. Surrounding it were shadowy figures, people in ancient costumes, pale faces, empty eyes. James stepped back, his heart pounding. The knocking sounded, slow and steady. He shouted, "What do you want from me?" A cold voice rang out from behind him, "You've seen me. You belong to me now." James turned, but the room was empty. When he looked back at the window, the black dog was gone, leaving only a thick fog. The next morning, the innkeeper found James's room empty. His belongings were still there, but there was no trace of him. The villagers said that they heard roars and screams coming from the woods that night, but no one dared to go and check. The black dog, as usual, disappeared after delivering its omen. And from then on, the villagers said that sometimes, on foggy nights, if you passed the edge of the village, you could hear a low growl, and glowing red eyes would appear in the darkness, watching you. Story 20. The Haunted Dollhouse. The antique shop on the outskirts of Crestfall has always been a magnet for lovers of the strange. But deep in the dark corners of the shop, there is one item that no one dares to buy, a dollhouse. The house is meticulously crafted, with amazingly small details, from the patterned wallpaper to the tiny chairs. But what makes it so famous are the rumors that it is more than just a toy. It is said that this dollhouse has the ability to recreate mysterious cases, and whoever owns it will be caught up in a series of unexplainable events. Lena, a young collector, does not believe in ghost stories. When she sees the dollhouse in the shop, she is fascinated by its perfect beauty. "A work of art like this cannot be left alone," she tells the shop owner, an older woman with a worried face. "This house is not like the others," the landlady warned. "If you buy it, be prepared. Once it chooses you, there will be no turning back." Lena just smiled and took the dollhouse home. The first night, Lena placed the dollhouse on the table in the living room and admired it. Every detail was exquisitely crafted. She noticed that every room in the house was fully furnished, but in one corner of the living room of the dollhouse, there was a blood-red stain on the floor. She thought it was just a small mistake in the process, and didn't pay much attention. But when she woke up the next morning, she noticed something strange. The red stain in the dollhouse was no longer in the same place. It had spread, like blood was seeping through the wood. The following days, Lena began to hear strange sounds coming from the dollhouse at night. Soft laughter, tiny footsteps, and sometimes whispers. She thought she was imagining things because she was overworked. But then, one night, while checking the dollhouse, she saw a sight that made her freeze. In the living room of the dollhouse, a small doll lay on the floor, surrounded by a red stain that grew more and more visible. A tiny hammer lay next to the doll, and on the wall, there was a red mark that stretched like a handprint. Terrified, Lena researched the origins of the house. Through old documents, she discovered that the dollhouse had belonged to a wealthy family in the last century. The owner, a woman named Margaret, was obsessed with recreating her family life in the dollhouse. But after a murder in the family, where her husband was killed with a hammer, and Margaret was accused but never admitted to the crime, the dollhouse mysteriously disappeared. Lena felt a chill run down her spine. She tried to put the dollhouse away in the closet, but strangely, every morning it reappeared on the table, as if it had moved on its own. One night, Lena was awakened by laughter. Not a small laugh, but a distorted, haunting laugh, coming from the living room. She went downstairs and found the dollhouse glowing strangely. When she looked inside, she saw that all the dolls had changed places. They were standing around the living room, as if attending a ceremony. In the middle of the tiny room, a new doll appeared, a doll with a face exactly like Lena's, with eyes wide open in fear. Panicking, Lena tried to burn the dollhouse. But the fire did not burn it. Instead, the details of the dollhouse continued to change. Every day, it recreated a new case, bloodstains, signs of violence, and new dolls appeared, all with panicked expressions, like the victims. Lena eventually disappeared one rainy night. When the neighbors called the police, they found only the dollhouse on a table. Inside, they found a new doll, a young woman with long hair and a face identical to Lena's, standing in the living room, surrounded by red streaks. The people of Crestfall say that if you see the dollhouse anywhere, stay away. Because once it chooses you, you will become part of its story forever.